Welcome to the second day of IWE Text and Context, a symposium cum workshop being organized by IWE Online. The first talk for today is the second part of yesterday's talk and workshop, and we'll have Professor Avishek Parui with us doing memory studies. So may I please welcome Professor Parui?
Well, thanks very much, and apologies for the delay, which is entirely my fault. So I'll just jump right to it. You may have received two PDFs about the two short stories that I will attempt to read in this session. The first being the Jhumpa Lahiri short story, A Temporary Matter. The second is the Gita Hariharan short story, The Remains of the Feast. So I'll just draw a little bit on what I said yesterday, theoretically, and then see how we can map that onto readings of these two stories. So if you remember, we talked about how the idea of memory should sort of have a deconstructive view whereby the interplay of remembering and forgetting, the interplay of reconstruction and anticipation should be seen as entanglements rather than oppositional categories. So what you remember can also become anticipatory and also aspirational in quality. At a political level, at a collective level, nostalgia can be profoundly aspirational. Right? So you're looking forward to a certain kind of future, having reconstructed through a metonymic method some bits of the past, which will serve your purpose to give you the right kind of cognitive cultural toolkit whereby you can imagine, anticipate, aspire for a certain kind of future. We talked about that yesterday, if you remember. Now, when you come to short fiction, the reason why I picked two short stories is because A, short fiction allows you an episodic understanding of memory. It gives you a slice of time which allows you depth as well as the horizontality. We talked about the verticality, horizontality interplay, whereby you get the sort of insight, as it were, into the stream of consciousness, into the thinking process, into thoughtfulness, mindfulness, and all the rest of it. But of course, that is also profoundly situated in certain cultural, material, social conditions. Now, the Lahiri story, of course, the diaspora narrative. We have second generation Indian diasporas, Bengali diaspora in Boston, which is pretty much the setting of most of Lahiri's fiction, as you all know, namesake being a good case in point. Now, A Temporary Matter, and I'm hoping most of you read it, even before I sent it to you. It's a really popular story from the Pulitzer winning collection that she wrote, Interpret of Melodies. It's about a Bengali couple, Shobha and Shukumar. Shukumar is doing PhD in agrarian revolts in India at an unnamed American university. We can guess it's probably Boston because they're based in Boston. And Shobha, the wife, she's working as a proofreader in a publishing house in the same place. And very sort of cheeky way, a semi-serious reading of the story can also reveal this is a big advertisement against doing a PhD in academia, right? So there's a 35-year-old jobless man who still doesn't have any clue as to what is going to happen to him. And so, among other things, it's some kind of a cautionary tale. Do not do PhD. Anyway, we'll leave it at that. But the story begins, as most Lahiri stories do, in a classic in media res situation, right? In the middle of something. Suddenly, there is this announcement which comes from the power supply company that every day for the next couple of weeks, there'll be a power cut sharp at 8 p.m. every evening. And they are given a warning in advance just so they can prepare accordingly. Now, that is the beginning of the story, that there will be a power cut. And of course, the announcement also says it's a temporary matter. Right? So it's obviously they're apologizing for the inconvenience, but it's a temporary matter. They are working on something and they will hopefully fix it in time. As it happens in the story, it is fixed before time, which becomes the problem. Now, the story then gives us some kind of background as to what is happening in that household. So here we have two aspirational middle-class Bengali diaspora, husband-wife, in an otherwise perfectly middle-class American home with middle-class American amenities. If you look at the kitchen, it is very well stacked. They have all kinds of kitchen utensils, technology, coffee maker, and the descriptions in the house, as Lahiri also does very frequently, is very, very carefully and meticulously woven, right? Because again, This is why we talked about, if you remember, the relationship between memory and materiality, right? So the materials become very, very important, and the kitchen supplies become very important metaphors of memory, particularly in this story, as do dresses. So there are a lot of descriptions of dresses. The sartorial details are very important. The gastronomic details are very important. And in fact, both stories, and the reason why I picked these two stories is because food plays a very important role in both stories. The second one, the Gita Hariharan story, the food is about sort of the embodied subversion in a certain sense, the corporeal subversion of certain patriarchal order. With the Lahiri story, it is a little bit less political, but it is more Gutaudian in quality, right? So we have this stacking up of food, storing of food for a desirable future. And what happens when the future disappears, right? So what happens to all the food in the house? You have to empty it out. So among other things, the Lahiri story is a story about liquidation, right? If you know what liquidation is an economy term. It means sort of shutdown of a company. So a company gets liquidated, assets get liquidated. So in terms of how the contract, the asset, and I'm deliberately using economic metaphors because the obligatory contractual transactional relationship established between the human beings over here is coming to an end. And as it happens, towards the end of the story, a new contract is signed. Those of you who read the story would remember that there's a new tenancy contract which is signed at the end of the story. A new lease is signed at the end of the story, which obviously suggests a symbolic departure and moving out from the earlier contract to a different contract, right? So there is that going on in that story. Now we get a bit of a background in the story in terms of Shukumar doing his PhD from American University, like I mentioned, on agrarian revolts in India. Shobha being this more mobile, more smart, more urban, a more commonsensical and pragmatic person who gets the money, who's a earner really in the household. But there is this spectral presence in the house. So something must have happened. There is a sense that Larry often does it, in a fiction. The event happens before the story in a certain sense, and the rest of the story carries on as some kind of a post-memory narrative, right? So the event has happened, the memory has happened. Now the legacy of the memory, in this case, the spectrality of the memory or the weight of the memory gets passed on. And the rest of the story is a very dense description of the corporeality of memory, the fleshing out of memory, which is ironical in this sense because it is about the non-arrival of a body, right? Those of you who read the story would know that this is a story about a child dying. So the child that they were about to have is dead, right? So the dead child, the dead son, as it turns out in the end, is very much a spectral presence in the story. In some sense, that is the protagonist who sort of gives the engine to the narrative of the story, shapes the narrative of the story, as it were, from a spectral position. It's a bit like what happens in Hamlet, but of course, a little different as well. So we get to know that there is a sense of an aspiration or an anticipation which has been thwarted, right? So the anticipation has come to an end. So in that sense, it is also a story about, in a very ironical sense, timelessness, right? So when I say liquidation, I mean it as a space-time chronotopic way. So the liquidation, the shutting down of space and time. This home is about to get shut down, right? And of course, the time is also about to get shut down. And unsurprisingly and very, very symbolically, appropriately, a new lease is signed. Of course, when you sign a new lease, when you sign a new contract, it is very temporal in quality, as you all know. Those of us who had the misfortune of signing tenancy agreements would know the legality of the agreement is spatio-temporal. So you have access to the square feet of space, but also you have access to it till a certain point of time. So it is profoundly spatio-temporal in quality. So the liquidation in the story, the shutdown, the spatio-temporal shutdown is obviously connected to the memory of the child who did not appear, right? So there is a spectral quality, the ghostly quality, the phantom quality of memory, right? And you can see how the phantomness of the child, as it were, the spectrality of the child gets more and more thickened in the story, right? Now, of course, what happens subsequently in the story is this game that they begin to play. And again, Professor Mukherjee would be interested to have a conversation about this later, where this husband and wife were getting more and more estranged, disconnected from each other, suddenly devised this game. And what is this game? It's a confession game. So every time there's a power cut, they finish the dinner quickly. And it's very elaborate description, gastronomic, culinary description of how the meat is cooked, how the spices are added, how the rice is boiled. It's very dense, very detailed, because the food in the story serves different functions. Of course, the food keeps the body alive, as it normally does, but the food also, the preparation and consumption of food is the only attempt that Shukumar has left to fill in time, right? So food has a temporal quality. He starts cooking very elaborately. That gives him a sense of temporality, right? And the entire story is about temporality, which is why it's called a temporary matter in that sense. But of course, the food is also coming to an end, right? So it's almost like a sinking ship. It is about to get shut down, and the kitchen must be liquidated, must be emptied out. So all these very elaborate culinary preparation and the eating and preparing of food is detailed in very dense ways, obviously very deliberately in Lyry. I mean, everything, when you read a writer of Lyry's quality, everything is deliberate, right? It's all very wonderfully woven in. So the power cuts begin to happen in the story, and Shobha proposes this game, this very ludic way to spend time. That let us tell each other things we haven't told earlier yet, right? So it's almost become some kind of a confessor chamber kind of a thing, right? So they confess to each other in darkness when the power is out, right? And it begins with a very shallow, superficial way. So Shukumar says something like, when we went to have dinner together for the first time, I forgot to tip the waiter. So I went back and tipped the waiter. And Shobha asks, but why did you forget? And then Shukumar reveals it, because when I was having dinner with you, I had a feeling that I might marry you. And I got distracted. And Shobha says something else, and it sort of goes on in a very innocuous way until it gets darker and darker, until it gets really interesting. And then, of course, the moment of anagnosis, as it were, the revelation of truth that happens towards the end. But we'll come to that bit a little bit later. The other thing which I want to highlight a little bit is the sort of very historicist understanding of human emotion. So we know that when the tragedy happened, when Shobha lost the child, Shukumar was in Baltimore for a conference. So, he had gone to attend a conference because he thought that going to a conference will help him network a little bit. He was about to finish his PhD. And also remember, this was a time before the mobile phone. So the entire communication economy in the story, the memory economy in the story is pre-digital in quality. And that, in a way, also shapes the nature of memory, also shapes the nature of communication. And I'm probably boring you now, but it's absolutely important, imperative, as it were, to remember that in nature, the ontology of memory, the ontology of communication is profoundly dependent on the materiality, right? So, there's this shallow joke that some scholars crack at each other, that if Romeo and Juliet had mobile phones, no one would die, right? They would just text each other and say, well, hang on, don't eat it. It's meant for someone else, right? But so many of tragedies that happen because there are no mobile phones, right? If only Thomas Hardy had a mobile phone, the entire industry of chance and coincidence would disappear. That would be a bad thing for him. But you can see how you need to historicize materiality, not in a shallow, superficial way, but also as its profound instruments through which human emotions, economies, or exchanges can be shaped, manipulated, controlled in certain sense. So, of course, Shukumar goes to the conference at Baltimore in a hotel, as it happens in America. There's massive conferences in hotels where he leaves behind his phone number, as in the hotel's phone number, to Shobha in case something goes wrong. And the receptionist comes and finds him and gives him a number from the hospital, and he calls back the hospital. And of course, the tragedy is revealed that the child is dead. The son bit comes in the end. And the story, that is the backstory from which the story is sort of being pushed forward. And everything comes to an end. That is the moment of closure in the story. So this brief ludic interplay that happens in between, where they begin to talk to each other, they begin to touch each other, they begin to make love to each other, happens to a game, happens to some kind of a game system where they tell random confessions to each other. And it's not a competitive game, and no one's winning this game, as it was. So in that sense, it's not really a game. But there is this playful quality, this fun quality where they send out some information from the system to the other person that they hadn't shared before, right? So that is the whole, the meat of the story, as it were. And of course, it goes on until it begins to look normal and nice and even romantic, right? Where they had spent some days, some evenings, and Shubha comes back early from office just so she can finish dinner early by 7:30, just so they can play the game. So there seems to be this longing for each other, which had vanished before. The memory of the romantic past is seemingly coming back in the story, right? Until, of course, that evening, when they get another announcement, another notification from the electric supply company saying, well, the work was finished before time, right? So the power will come back. The power will not go at 8 p.m. from the following evening, right? So because they had somehow managed to finish the job before the anticipated time. So again, the temporality of fixing and the temporality of stories were in sync with each other, but now obviously it begins to become different, right? So, and that is where the moment of truth, revelation of truth, takes place, where they come back, Shobha comes back home, and then there was no power cut anymore. So this entire sort of the orchestrated cosmetic candlelight dinner is gone. It's not possible to have it anymore, right? And somehow the cosmetic candlelight dinner had somehow managed to create the original economy of love, the original economy of romance. The memory of that past was coming in. And also remember how this particular game, which is basically a memory game in a certain sense, because they remember things they hadn't told to each other, right? Or they remember things that they did not remember to tell each other. And that is the whole crux of the game, right? So you have to say something to the other person that you forgot to say many years ago or did not say many years ago. So in that sense, it's a memory economy. The entire thing is a ludic, playful memory where they are giving snippets to each other. And somehow, in a very metonymic way, it begins to almost heal the memory economy. It almost begins to heal the entire romance between them, the relationship, the kinship, the tactility. Like I said, they begin to touch each other. And the whole idea of estrangement seems to be disappearing. They seem to be coming closer to each other. So in a very interesting sense, memory creates or recreates kinship over here, recreates intimacy, recreates touch, recreates the whole idea of relationship, right? So it begins to come back, except that it doesn't, right? And that is the blunt force of the story that is revealed at the end. Again, those of you who read the story would know that the day when power doesn't disappear, Shobha comes back and says, well, and Sukumar is about to turn the light out because he thinks, well, let's continue this game. Let's turn out the light and, create this illumination out of memory, right? So the candlelight, and we illuminate ourselves through memory without artificial light. Of course, as it happens, that power coming back or electricity coming back becomes a problem because now they are forced to experience artificial illumination. So that intimacy, which is only possible through darkness, through this memory game, will not work anymore, right? So there is that sense of temporality. It was a temporary matter. The fixing of cables was a temporary matter. And the pseudo-healing process that was happening to the memory game was also a temporary matter. But this is a moment of truth when Shubha looks at Shukumar and says, well, I am moving out. I just signed a tenancy agreement. And again, notice the legality of the language. She has subscribed to or signed up for a new space-time, right, where she's going to build new memories. And so that there is a sense of liquidation, which is why I use that very mercenary metaphor at the beginning. So the company is about to get shut down. The company is about to, the assets are dissolved, as it were, which is a classic meaning of liquidation, right? So this space-time is coming to an end. This ship is about to sink. The food supply is about to end. The kitchen is about to get empty, right? And there are constant flashback narrations of how the kitchen was full once upon a time, how there was abundance of wine and meat and parties, how there was love and laughter in the house, so many human voices in the house, etc. And of course, it cuts back into the present, where there's absolute emptiness and soundlessness. So again, sounds play a very important role in the story as well. There's this very interesting image of the bazaar, where Shubha is seen as haggling with the Italian butchers in a very noisy bazaar, and Shukumar is just following her at the back like a very obedient person. So the soundscapes in the story, which keep coming back, sort of bring back the memory of a happier time, of course, that the whole thing is done to accentuate the opposite, that it's gone now, it's disappeared now. Now all we have is spectrality and silence, till they have this pseudo game where they start filling in the sounds again by telling snippets of memory, by telling this little memory montage to each other. And that is how they are about to fill in the sound again, fill in the house again, and they're about to laugh until light comes back. Now, the other thing that is interesting for us is a photoplay in the story. Light coming back over here is a problem. Light coming back over here takes away the memory. Light coming back over here takes away the entire confession economy, the confession space-time. Now they can't confess to each other anymore. They must encounter the blunt truth, which is what Shobha delivers at this point of time, where she tells Shukumar that I am moving out, right? And of course, what happens right after is very violent. So at the level of knowledge, there is epistemic violence which is taking place, because Shukumar realizes that Shobha had known this all along. That Shobha had been preparing for this all along. She must have been going and checking with plumbers and pipes, electricities and tenants agreements. She had been doing this all along, while also coming back home and pretending to play this memory game. So he feels profoundly cheated. He feels profoundly let down. And he realizes the entire memory game was just an absolute bogus game, because it didn't have any purpose at all. It was never really taking them back anywhere, right? It was just filling in the time before she was to move out, right? So it was part of the clinicality of the process. It was part of the liquidation. It wasn't part of the healing. It wasn't part of going back. It wasn't part of any reversal of any kind. So the sense of going back in time, the sense of remembering happy time, is a false start. It's a false sense, right? It was a fake thing entirely. It was a deceptive start. And that, of course, angers him profoundly. So what does it do at the end of the story? Those of you who read the story would know. He decides to tell Shobha that one thing he promised never to say. And what is that? The gender of the child, right? And we get to know at the end that he had lied to Shobha about not seeing the dead child. He had actually come back just in time to hold the baby before it was buried, and was a boy. And he decides to tell Shobha the graphic details of how the baby looked. Now, this is very, very interesting in a certain cognitive sense. The knowledge of not knowing the baby's gender, the knowledge of not having any memory about the baby, had paradoxically given some kind of the mystery of not knowing had given some kind of a closure to Shobha, that I did not know what that was, right? So that protected her to a certain extent, and enabled her to cope with, enabled her to move on, right? The fact that she did not hold it, right? Of course, if you read the story in more details, I will not go into those details. Even the arrangement of furniture in the house is very interesting, because they had prepared a nursery for the child. They had prepared, and if you look at the nursery, what kind of space is nursery? It's a space where a child is brought up, a new time begins, right? So it was designed with little cots and lovely little wallpapers and toys and everything else. And of course, when they come back home with the knowledge of the dead child, Shukumar violently decimates the room. So there's a lot of violence in which the entire room was decimated, right? It was completely torn apart. The wallpapers are torn apart. The furniture is broken, decimated. And what does it become subsequently? Very interesting. It becomes that room in which Shukumar's thesis is not getting written, right? So it becomes an inertia space. It becomes a space where things do not move anymore. Words cannot be written anymore. Time cannot grow anymore. Space-time has been shut down, right? So it becomes quite literally and symbolically a shutdown space, that liquidated space where nothing can grow anymore. So from the space which was supposed to grow a human being, which is supposed to create this atmosphere of happiness and liberty and aspiration and anticipation, it becomes a space of memorylessness. It becomes a space where nothing can grow. So Shukumar's thesis doesn't grow anymore. So in a very interesting symbolic parallel, the death of the child and the death of Shukumar's thesis happen together. So his thesis doesn't move anymore. He's stuck over there. So that block, the writer's block that you experience, is almost biological in quality. The fact that it cannot parent a child and the fact that it cannot author a thesis together, they happen in the same temporal level, right? Now, coming back towards the end of the story, of course, when Shukumar gets absolutely outraged by the fact that Shobha has been manipulating him, manipulating his memory but also having taken a clinical decision to move out, outrages him, and he, there's this vendetta moment where he decides to give that knowledge to Shobha, right? The knowledge which will not allow her to move on as easily as she did, right? Because she was protected by the knowledgelessness in a certain sense. It's not ignorance. Knowledgelessness is a different thing, right? So she knew, but she did not know, right? She knew that she lost a child, but she had no human vision of the child. She had no human description of the child. So a child to him or her continued to be a phantom presence, whereas to Shukuma, it was a human biological presence. So that was a real loss because he held the human being before he buried, right? So very graphic details are given at the end of the story where Shukuma tells the color of the skin of the child, the gender of the child, and also how his fingers curled while he slept, just like hers do, right? And that attachment is obviously a violent attachment. That attachment is not an attachment of intimacy or empathy. That's an attachment deliberately done to create a permanent trauma, a permanent violence, right? So in a very paradoxical way, temporary matter ends with a sense of permanent trauma, right? So this trauma is not transferred, right? So we talked about yesterday, if you remember, how the non-transference of trauma or traumatic memory in a certain sense can also be a way to protect the subsequent generations. So we talk about post-memory, but there are also instances where certain collective identities, where certain demographies, and Kundera talks about that in the book of Laughter and Forgetting, they decide not to remember. They decide not to talk about it so as to protect the transmission of memory to happen from the next generation. So the next generation grows up without the burden of traumatic memory. Here, it's a transference. It's a cruel transference of memory that takes place, right? So the story ends, obviously, in a moment of suspension where both Shukuma and Shobha are crying, weeping together for what they knew now, right? So it obviously, the temporary matter ends, the story ends, the space-time gets shut down, but there is a permanent marker of loss, which is transferred over to Shobha as well. Now she cannot unremember it anymore, right? She cannot unhear it anymore. She cannot unremember it anymore. So the lost child, the phantom presence, becomes a real human being, right? And the rehumanization of loss over here towards the end of the story creates this permanent marker of memory, right? So that sense, it's a perfect memory story if you read it. And of course, as you all know, that Lahiri is someone who is extremely careful about the craft. So there's a lot of Chekhov, a lot of Joyce, a lot of Maupassant. So at the level of craft, she completely comes from that tradition, the classic short story tradition, where there is this episodicity at the end, but also density where it's required, right? So there's interplay of density, spectrality, and episodicity, and the episodic quality, as it were. It really, this triangulation of the episodic, the dense, and the spectral, it creates a perfect memory narrative, which is a temporary matter, right? Now, allow me to now use the other story as some kind of a case study in terms of how it can integrate some of the things we discussed yesterday. Remains of the Feast, which obviously is a more graphic story, and in some sense, it will also interest those of you who work in the intersection of memory and medical humanities, because it is a story about. It's told from a doctor's perspective. It's narrated. The narrator in the story is an aspiring doctor, is a woman called Ratna, Tamil woman, who is studying to become a doctor. We get to know that she's a gold medalist, typical Tamil middle class, Brahmin home, where food becomes again a very important part, a very important symbol over here. And eating certain kinds of food in this particular story is also an attempt of a dying human body to make memories, right? So it's in a way, it's the opposite of what happens in Jhumpa Lahiri. So eating in Lahiri's fiction is an act of liquidation, is an act of shutting down of a space which is sinking in a certain sense. It's like a ship which has wrecked, and all you can do is you can sort of end the supplies as quickly as possible before the ship sinks. In the Gita Hariharan story, the Remains of the Feast, you know that the desperation with which the very old dying woman Rukmini, this Tamil widow who we find had outlived her son for 10 years, right? 90-year-old widow who is dying of cancer. Just at the fag end of her life, she desperately starts eating things which are forbidden to her. She eats food cooked by non-Brahmin hands. She eats pastries run by a Christian shop, which hire Muslim cooks, we are told. And all these seem to give her almost some kind of erotic pleasure in terms of how she can make memories before she dies. So this becomes the exact opposite, ontologically speaking, of what happens in Lyra's fiction. This is a very corporeal attempt to make memories. And I use the word corporeal again and again, but it is exactly what it is. It's a corporealization of memory. It's an entirely embodied memory. She doesn't have a mind anymore. We are told that her mind is wandering to different places. She doesn't really have the high cognitive functions, but all that she can do is eat, eat and eat and eat things which are forbidden to her, right? And in the process, she creates body memories. She creates embodied memories. The viscerality in the story is very, very important. We are giving graphic descriptions of her body, the very uncouth, dying body, extremely inelegant, extremely anarchic. Of course, the pain that is there with the cancer, which must be causing her huge amounts of suffering. But the act of eating becomes an act of subversion in a certain sense. And also, this is a macro bit in the story, because if you remember, what we do in memory studies, we constantly connect the micro and the macro together. So the human being, the body, the brain, the neurons must also be connected to the horizontality of it. Where is it situated? What's the cultural condition we are looking at? What kind of a socio-political, moral landscape are we looking at in terms of the situated brain, to use Andy Clark again, right? So Rukmini in the story, this great-grandmother, her dying, obviously, can be seen as the end of a certain kind of temporal order. So that, too, is an end of one space-time, as it were. But interestingly, that space-time gets more and more compressed in her body. So it's a bit like what happens in Toba Tek Singh, if you remember Toba Tek Singh, where the feet get swollen in the end. So it almost becomes a corporalization of time or a temporalization of the body, right? So the time enters the body and swells the body, and then, of course, the body collapses in the end. Something similar happens with Rukmini, right? So that sense of time, that entire lifetime that she had spent being ordered by patriarchy, what to eat, what to wear, how to behave, that begins to become grotesquely subversive in the end. And there is this sort of sense of comedy of the grotesque that takes place in the Gita Hariharan's story. And it's a very deliberately depicted grotesque body. And the grotesqueness of a body, the inelegance of a body in the end, is exactly what makes it subversive. So we have the descriptions of mucus and urine and all kinds of bodily fluids coming out of her nostrils. This entire messiness of the mutable body is very deliberately foregrounded again and again. That is not just concealed. It is never concealed. It is foregrounded. It's made spectacular, really. And of course, we need to remind ourselves of the fact, like you mentioned at the beginning, the entire story is told from a doctor's perspective, right? So it's an aspiring doctor. So we have this sort of legacy narrative, as it were. One old woman dying, having suffered at the hands of patriarchy, having suffered throughout her whole life at the hands of a very rigid, caste-based, legality of what to eat, what to wear, etc. And the mad attempt in the end, the desperate attempt in the end to subvert that is also some kind of a transference to the next generation, right? And you see what happens at the end of the story is very, very interesting. When the great-granddaughter inherits that subversion in a certain sense, what does she do towards the end? So let me just talk a little bit about the end. We'll come back at the middle again. At the end, if you read the story, it almost becomes, it continues the comedy of the grotesque to a large extent. So the great-grandmother dies. And what does the great-granddaughter do? She goes out in the market to the fly-infested, the dirtiest, dingiest place in the market, where she continues to gobble samosas and fries and onion bhajis till she gives herself diarrhea, right? And that's the line which appears in the story. I give myself diarrhea, right? So that diarrhea, that bodily condition where you're eating the abject, where you're consuming the abject, where you're consuming the forbidden, to the extent that the body now behaves, the body must respond with diarrhea. So the moment of diarrhea, the moment of contracting diarrhea is also a moment of subversion. So I give myself the triumph of diarrhea. I reward myself. I push myself to the point that I give myself diarrhea. So again, the medical the medical term is very, very interesting over here. It's a metaphor as well as a real medical situation, which is why I think it's a story which should interest those of you working in intersections of memory studies and medical humanities, because it's a doctor's story. about subversion. It's a doctor's story about eating bad food. It's a doctor's story about eating forbidden food in a certain sense. Now, I will end now with the other thing that is interesting in the Gita Hariharan story, which is obviously the whole idea of the sartorial conformity, right? So this being a widow, she has to abide by a certain kind of sartorial code, as you all know, this very, very Brahminical code that is imposed on her. And she decides to subvert it in the end. She wants to wear this garish red sari in the same way as she wants to consume this onion bhajis from the fly-infested bazaar. So again, the gastronomic and the sartorial subversions are connected to each other in that sense. And also, from a memory perspective, this is a desperate attempt to make memories at the end, right? To be remembered in a certain way, to be remembered as a woman who consumed forbidden food, to be remembered as a woman who was burnt while wearing the red sari. And of course, interestingly and appropriately, the agent that she leaves behind, the great-granddaughter, the aspiring daughter, she fulfills her wish in the end. She does dress her up in the red sari before the mother comes and takes it off. Of course, she's sent out in the end, having been dressed up as this very pious widow that she had to be throughout her life. But there's one moment of subversion where she does dress up, and she's made to dress up, the great-granddaughter, the aspiring daughter, who gives herself diarrhea in the end as a reward for what she has done, dresses her up in her last death wish, right? Now, there are two moments, there are two more images that I will spend some time in before I finish this formally. The one is that really interesting image where the great-grandmother, Rukmini, who is about to die, the doctors know, the doctors say that it is a matter of time, and she's got this entire IV thing pinned on her entire body, and she's got syringe and all kinds of injections in her bed, and she's essentially someone who is a medical body, right? So someone who's got endless syringes, endless things pinned on her. And that one moment of subversion in the hospital where she flings her arm open and the entire IV thing collapses, right? And that happens in front of the doctor, right? In front of the aspiring doctor as well, the great-granddaughter. So that moment of medical subversion, that moment of throwing away the machinery of medicine, which are trying to pin her down in the same way as the culture that she grew up in had been trying to pin her down. Are you okay there? Is everything all right? Are you okay there? Yeah, thanks, right, okay. So that moment of subversion is really interesting and very graphic as well, very visual as well, like the visual imagery of the red sari, which appears in the end, where she flings her arms open, that one last attempt to ask for the forbidden food, and in the process, she dismantles the medical machinery which are controlling her body. So that becomes interesting. The other image, of course, the final image, literally the last image in the story, where when Ratna comes back at the end of the final rites of her great-grandmother, and after having given herself diarrhea, she comes back to the room, she takes away everything that belonged to the great-grandmother and starts filling in all these spaces in the room with medical books. And what do they look like? Soldiers about to march, right? So again, that becomes the ultimate, and that is a memory legacy, the memory continuity. The great-grandmother who subverts the order that was imposed on her gives the memory transference. So both stories about memory transference, if we can begin to see the point now, but very different kinds of transference. One is paralyzing. One gives the sense of clinicality. That kind of a liquidation is a transference of liquidation, transference of trauma, where Shukumar decides not to protect Shobha anymore from the non-knowledge, right? The second one is the transference, which is enabling inequality. So I transfer this subversion to you. I transfer this desire to make memories to you, just so you can continue and put your books in order, just so they begin to march for you in the times to come. The medical books, which obviously are the enabling apparatus through which the great-granddaughter can march ahead in time, find her own rules, forge her own rules, and acquire agency in a very public process of becoming a doctor, right? So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope this is able to connect some of the things we discussed yesterday, and I'm very happy to answer a few questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parui. We will now take questions, comments, responses to the presentation.
course, I worked under the assumption that all of you read the stories, and I trust you more than I trust my students at IIT Madras, but that may have been misplaced. I don't know. But if anyone wants to ask something about yesterday's thing as well, any theoretical questions, I'm very happy to engage with those too.
Hello, sir. Good morning. So I was just wondering. Yesterday you were talking about collective memory, right? So I was just wondering if some memory that is present in the collective consciousness of the people or the unconscious of the people, how do we deal with it? Because there is also the case of forgetfulness. Like you were talking about how forgetting is also an agency like that is used by people to dictate memory, the way the collective group of people think or not think. So, how does memory studies deal with something like that that can be considered propaganda or even false memory?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And a large part, of course, we don't even have to go to the extreme example of propaganda. Even what we call history in a Cutodian sense is it's got propaganda written all over it, maybe in a more covert way, right? So what memory studies attempts to do as a discipline is look at the overt and covert ways in which the interplay of encoding and erasure takes place. And I think one of the assumptions we work with is a deconstructive assumption that every act of encoding is also already an act of erasure, right? So it doesn't have to be an extreme example. So, for instance, I was told, I haven't been to China, but I'm told that a friend of mine who went there some years ago, actually, that if you go to China, apparently, and go to what is Google to them, the search box that they use over there, and type Tiananmen Square massacre, you get zero results, apparently. That was something was told to me. That has been erased entirely by the digitality, the digital apparatus, which controls new memory formation, right? So, and of course, this is an extreme example, right? And we can think of other examples across the world, across human history, nothing really exclusive about what I just said. I mean, even pre-print culture, even pre-digital culture have had their ways to suppress and amplify certain kinds of memories. But I think at a theoretical level, even the Cutodian memory processes that we look at, that's the bias is just there, even in the most innocuous ways, right? And in a certain sense, every memory is manipulative. The brain is a manipulative machine. The brain manipulates us all the time. And it makes us fall in love with certain things. It makes us resist certain things. And a large part of what we are is quote-unquote irrational inequality, right? And I think we may debunk Freud for many things. I think neuroscience has debunked Freud almost entirely. I think even a BA psychology or BAc psychology 101 will not have any reference to Freud except for historical things. So that is fine, and I'm completely okay with that. But one of the things we have to acknowledge that Freud did, of course, he wasn't working in isolation. He was part of a Zeitgeist at that moment, was to really articulate the importance of the unconscious. The very fact that a large part of who we are as a primate is actually unconscious, is things we do, things we eat, things we behave, large chunks of it is an unconscious process. And the brain must be unconscious of most of the things it does. If it begins to become conscious of everything that we do, then that becomes other kinds of cognitive problems. And I think in the same way, when you look at cultural memory or collective memory, which is what we do, this entire traffic between the brain and the world, how it collides and colludes, right? So there is this collusive quality in collective memory as well, where it sort of goes with the ideological impulse of the time. It goes with the discursive designs of the time, and it manipulates memory in those directions, right? So we have to be absolutely clear of the fact that even in non-extreme situations, even in non-dystopian situations, memory, both in its collective way as well as in molecular way, is a manipulative process, right? Where every act of encoding is also already an act of erasure, right? And that acknowledgement helps us intellectually as well, because I think someone asked a really good question yesterday that, or maybe I use that question to say it, that if we make the argument that there is nothing called completely reliable memory, the why study history, well, that's an escapist way to look at it, right? And that's a little bit lazy intellectually. What we should be doing instead is to acknowledge the fact that the objective is always already subjective. Of course, we all do that in human and social sciences, but the opposite is also true. the subjective is also objective, right? So what we say is personal and, completely impulsive and subjective is also already colored by the objective, right? Which is why I used the modernist epiphany yesterday. Even the deepest, most glamorous epiphanies that you can think of, modernist fiction, is situated somewhere. There is a cultural, moral matrix which is shaping that vocabulary. So I think that acknowledgement is not just academically important, but also ethically important in memory studies. Yeah. Yeah.
So is memory about power as well? Because uh, as we see in the first story, it's like transactional in nature because uh, Shukuma stops her from forgetting, basically. Yeah, as you said, it's not ignorance, it's forgetlessness of the memory.
Yeah.
So is that the manipulative quality of the memory?
Yeah. That's a great observation, by the way. Thank you. So there's, of course, the coercive quality of memory, the fact that I don't allow you to forget anymore, right? And that becomes an act of violence, which is why I use the word epistemic violence. I'll give you that knowledge now, and now you'll be damned forever. You can't unremember it anymore, right? So if you think of more political examples in fiction, I mean, one of my favorite novels or novellas is Heart of Darkness, because it's a great novel for a PhD student, isn't it? It gives you everything. It ticks a box. So you want everything is there. Gender studies, masculinity studies, post-colonial. Very convenient if you want to fill up pages in a thesis, right? So that way it's very handy. But also, it's a novel where Marlowe cannot unremember it anymore, right? And storytelling in Heart of Darkness, you'll notice, is some kind of a exorcising program. I want to exorcise myself away from what haunted me by telling the story. So telling the story is a way of transferring the trauma, transferring away what happened, except that it doesn't work in Heart of Darkness, right? Because in some sense, it's an anti-story. It's a very badly told story, right? Which is why I'm sure, all of you are more intelligent than I am. But when I first read Heart of Darkness in 17, I hated it. So what stupid, boring novel. It's a 90 pages of absolute boredom. It doesn't take you anywhere. There's no adventure. It's a complete misadventure novel. It doesn't really take off at any point. It starts and comes back again, starts and comes back again. Only much later, when I was in my MA, I realized it's a deliberate thing because the entire novel is about the failure to tell what happened in Congo, right? And the fact that Marlowe cannot tell off his horror by transferring the story is part of the problem because his listeners go to sleep, if you remember, in Heart of Darkness. They're all so bored, they're going to sleep. They can't care less. And he keeps on exclaiming in a very self-reflexive way that I'm sure all of you are bored. I'm sure you think this is absurd, but this is the best I can do as a storyteller. So the fact that it's such an incompetent narrative is a deliberate process. And it sort of connects to your question because Marlowe's strategy of storytelling is to, well, I suffered this. Now this is my story. The moment you listen to this, you get infected by this memory. Now I pass it on in a vampiric Dracula kind of a way. Except that it doesn't work, right? The infection is unsuccessful. It's an incomplete infection, which is why it continues to be haunted by a story he cannot tell. But you're absolutely spot on. There is this coercive quality about memory, the sense of territorializing someone to memory. Well, I'll give you this memory, and that territorializes you. It confines you to a space-time, which is what happens at the end of a temporary matter, where the husband is saying, well, you may be earning a lot of money. You may be an agentic woman who is leaving my home, who's leaving my space-time, but let me give you this memory space-time, which will haunt you forever. You cannot leave it anymore, right? So there is that sense of revenge that, you have the money to leave my home, and I'm a jobless PhD student. Yes, fine. But I'll give you one more memory home that you cannot leave anymore. And that is a traumatic memory, which will haunt you forever. So absolutely it is coercive in quality.
So one more thing. So what do you mean by, one just clarification, the ontology of memory in nature is very materialistic?
Yeah, so what you remember and how you remember is profoundly influenced by what materials you're using to remember. So I think you'll all agree, I hope, that pre-digital memory is very different from post-digital memory. Because, I used my own example yesterday. The necessity to remember has changed. Because, back when there was no internet, people had to remember lots of things because you could not outsource it anymore, outsource it to other gadgets. But now you have machines remembering for you. So the need to remember has vanished in a certain sense. And of course, I don't want to go there, but if you look at the entire data industry, which has emerged, the memory industry which has emerged in complete collusion with capitalism, for instance. So, for instance, all the big multinationals like Amazon and Swiggy and Zomato, they all remember what you ate, what you purchased, what you consume, right? So this industrialization of memory is happening on an exponential level because the kinesis and contagion of memory is unprecedented today. The way memory can travel and the way memory can be stored is just almost endless in quality. So the point is, what is remembered and how it is remembered, they're connected with each other. So the matter of memory and the modality of memory should be connected, should be studied. And that's one of the primary theses in memory studies. You can't just say, well, this kind of memories happen, and so we must study in a very subjective way. What about the materials? What about the gadgets? What about the bricks and mortar and the algorithms, as it were, today that shape the memory, right? Because that is where the manipulations happen. So for any sophisticated study of memory, manipulation, question, and everything we're talking about, we must go to the root of memory, quite literally. So what are the nodal points through which memory is passing? What are the interfaces? Is it digital, analog, algorithmic, bricks and mortar? What kind of museums are we looking at? So the materiality, the mundane materiality of memory, I think should be part. And this is why I think memory studies meets cultural studies, right? The ethnography of memory, right? The materiality of memory, the ecology, what we call memory ecology, right? So we must historicize the memory ecology. Is it print? Is it preprint? Is it digital? Is it post-digital? Is it algorithmic? Because that will influence the kind of memory which is in circulation. That will in turn help us to study the hierarchies of memory, the historiographies of memory, and so on and so forth.
Uh, we were discussing about this virtual vocabulary of memory. Now, this is the memory of the algorithm, but an algorithm never forgets. So, how is that encoding and erasure thing happening? What is the line between data and memory?
Yeah, but of course, you can make an algorithm forget, right? You can make an erasure happen. So, in some sense, if you are algorithmizing memory, you can also erase algorithms, right? So you can make something disappear. So I just give an example, for instance, in an extreme situation like what I heard about what happens in China. So if you go to the search engines of China, the algorithms will refuse to remember, will prevent you, will resist some kind of memory which will go against what the collective is oriented towards forgetting, right? So I think what we should be looking at is memory orientations in algorithms, right? So what kind of orientations? And of course, as you can imagine, the moment you use the word orientation, we must bring in gender, we must bring in race, we must bring in different kinds of identity politics, the privileged identity, less privileged identity, because who has access to algorithms, who can manipulate data, who can control algorithms, will control the politics of encoding and erasure, right? Because the moment you can encode something in an algorithm, you can also erase it. You can make something go away very, very quickly if you have control over algorithms, right? But what you're also saying is very valid. Is at some level, what I call the deathless digital, right? Nothing really dies in the digital in a certain sense. And, you can see how even in very popular examples, if you look at things like film industries and celebrity industries, etc., how something someone said or did 20, 30 years ago can be brought back to shame that person, can be brought back to undercut the political stance or the ideological stance of the person. So there is that return of the repressed that can happen in a digital space as well, that you're meant to forget, that you're meant to erase, can be brought back as well. But it really allows for a manipulation at an industrial scale, right? Where you can encode, you can de-encode, you can re-encode, and we're not even going to something like deepfake, right? Let's not even get there, where the entire defamiliarization of data can happen, right? How you can take a data and defamiliarize it to an extent that you can create what is now known as post-truth or propaganda in a scale with a virality, with a velocity like never before, right? So that sense algorithms can really amplify this play of erasure and encoding, because whoever controls that is like controlling the narrative, right? So if you use the algorithm as a storytelling device, as Professor Mukherjee was mentioning yesterday, that if there is a politicization of algorithms, if the way that state controls algorithms or certain big companies can control algorithms, of course, that will control the kind of storytelling that they want to push forward in time. right? And also, I think I was chatting with Professor Mukherjee about this yesterday. Think of the potential danger of this. So when you say that, well, let's make certain kind of video games or algorithms which can bring back, give us a sense of what our past was. What if we have an apparatus collusive with a certain ideological principle which wants us to remember only a certain kind of past and nothing else? Right? So all the capital will be invested in that direction. So that will be pumped up again and again and again. And of course, what it also means is you're erasing other kinds of past, right? So every act of encoding, even in an algorithmic way, will also contain erasure of the highest kind. Perhaps it's more covert in algorithms, but it's that.
Hello, sir. Yesterday we were talking about anxiety and how it stems from anticipating scenarios. I figure the cognitive overload that happens from figuring out which scenarios might happen in a situation. So that cognitive function is only possible because the scenarios are not actually taking place. There is this absence of action. But in everyday lives, all of our thoughts are essentially coming out of a sort of void. Like, do we first decide to decide, or do we just decide? We don't know. A lot of our actions are coming out of a void, which we do not consciously know. So why is that? Firstly, my first question is, why does that not create a problem for us? And secondly, where does something like adventure come in? Like in terms of anxiety, at what point are you not anxious and the thing that you're doing is constituting something like an adventure?
Yeah. That's a great question. First of all the questions are from my yesterday's session, which means, anyway, but that's a great question. Thank you so much. But, there is this thing about unconscious which we must pay attention to, because no matter how non-conscious we are, it's not actually a void, because there is a neural trace. And there's a term called engram that you can look up. Someone called Endel Tulving, a British psychologist, wrote on this engram, E-N-G-R-A-M. So engram is that neural trace which stays in the brain. It sort of encodes information. It may or may not become memory. It may or may not become primary memory, but it's there. And sometimes you can, whether through a trigger, whether through a sense perception, you can recollect engrams quickly and connect it to what you act in terms of what you move ahead in time. So there is always a big data sheet in the brain that you're drawing in, right? You're plugged in a massive data sheet. You're plugged in a huge amount of neural firings and cognition and recognition systems which are governing your actions, right? But you're absolutely right when you say that a large part of what we do is unconscious, and it must be that, because being conscious of everything is a massive problem. And we have had case studies where that causes cognitive exhaustion, that causes cognitive overload, etc. Right? So there is a sense that you are plugged into a system, but you're not aware of it. So that creates a sense of reacting in a void, whereas in reality you're not. You're plugged into a system, except that when you do act in a void, which is what happens with trauma patients, for example, when that plugged in quality gets disconnected, right? So they don't know what to draw on. They don't have a template to draw on anymore, which can manifest itself through amnesia, different kinds of memory disorders, etc., which is a big cognitive problem. But in the quotidian quality of cognition, the way we go about our day-to-day lives, whether we're conscious or not, we're always drawing on a data. We're always drawing on engrams. We're always drawing on something which has happened before, which has left behind a memory trace or a neural trace of some kind, right? Whether we're conscious of it or not. And sometimes when it becomes a conscious plug-in that becomes memory, we are aware of memory. And it can become a meta process as well. You're aware of cognition, the metacognitive process. The second question, which is equally fascinating, is at what point does the whole idea of accidentality or anticipation become adventure, right? Now, I think you'll agree, and I think Professor Mukherjee is a better person to answer this question. So there is a pleasure component in adventure, right? So yes, it is unpredictable, which is why it is adventurous. But there has to be a certain degree of predictability of the outcome for it to be adventurous in the first place. Because at what point do you think And I'm not saying you can control the outcome, you can make yourself a winner every time. That's not what I'm saying at all. But it has to be non-precarious in a certain sense for it to become an adventure, right? Otherwise, for the recognition of something as an adventure and the transition from the accidental to the adventurous must be also a process of de-risking, right? Must also be a process of, it becomes less and less precarious in quality, because the moment it enters the realm of the adventure, from the realm of the accidental, there is a process of familiarity, there's a process of kinship, there's a process of quasi-predictability that comes in. Of course, it cannot be completely predictable, because that also undercuts adventure, because if you know the outcome, it doesn't stay adventure anymore. So I think what I'm arguing is there's a liminality about the adventurous. If you look at the ontology of the adventure, there's a liminal position between the precarious and the predictable, right? Because if it stays in a precarious position, that it continues to be accidental. It can produce precarity, it can produce risk, it can produce harm, it can produce dangers, right? And if it comes to the other extreme, if it becomes predictable, then it ceases to be adventurous in the first place. It just becomes boring. You know the outcome, you can game the system, etc., etc. So the liminality about the adventure is very, very important for us to understand. I think from a trauma perspective, if you look at someone like Catherine Malabou, who is a really fascinating philosopher to read, who has this brilliant book called The Ontology of the Accident that I recommend very, very heavily, where she talks about accident from a sort of by-do position of the event, that which has a before and after, that which creates a temporal break, etc., etc. But the very fact that it's an accident and not an adventure means that it becomes almost impossible to narrativize it. And that's the other bit that I want to end with in response to your question. An adventure can be narrated, right? An adventure lends itself to a narrative, which is why you have adventure fiction, adventure stories, right? You can't necessarily say that about an accident all the time, which is why, Malabou talks about the ontology of the accident, that traumatic gap between narration and event, right? That which you've experienced but cannot narrate anymore. Which is why I contend that Heart of Darkness is an example of misadventure fiction, right? He wants to translate the accident into adventure. He wants to turn that entire adventure story or accident story, the trauma story, the horror story, into a neat narrative, which is consumable and shareable in quality, except that it can't, right? It continues to be an accident story. It continues. I mean, the most memorable line in Heart of Darkness is what? The horror, right? Which pretty much tells what happens over here. There's no other line you remember as heavily as that moment of the horror, where narrative breaks, as it were, and the accident cannot translate to an adventure in that sense. But it's a great question. Thank you so much.
With that, we can conclude our session.
I have a question about today's talk. Right. So,
Thank you.
In the remains of the feast, I mean, when you keep repeating that it is significant that the narrator is going to be a doctor. However, she's not a doctor yet,
Yeah.
and she's not even started medical school yet in the story, right? Even when she begins the narration, we see that there's still a month left for her to start classes, and she's just reading up in advance, and she's just reading all those anatomy textbooks,
Yeah.
etc. So, I mean, what is really the significance of that particular plot point?
Yeah.
Where she's going to be a doctor. In my reading, I know that there's this one paragraph in the short story where she talks about how the anatomy textbook reduces the body to a certain set of colors and diminutive labels and all of that. And I feel like the entire story then acts as a counter narrative to that one paragraph where the anatomy textbook, reduces the body to something. However, there's so many affective dimensions involved. I know that hospitals and doctors and the body itself figure several times through the story. For example, the grandfather, who has a very, very small part to play,
Yeah.
is described as cadaverous himself. They mention antacids kept somewhere around and he has to constantly eat them.
Yeah.
The grandmother herself shows this very flippant nature towards doctors and hospitals. She says, "Oh, 30 years back, I went and I saw the doctor, and your grandfather, he was very afraid of blood and he would faint at the sight of it. But I'm not really very concerned about it." So uh, there is really a very flippant attitude towards doctors and the medical institution as such until the very end of the story. So
Yeah.
how would you read the significance of the narrator being,
Yeah.
a medical trainee, not a medical trainee, a future anticipatory medical
Yeah.
trainee?
Yeah. I think the answer lies in your question, which is a brilliant question, because we also have to acknowledge the gendering of medicine over here, because all the doctors are male in the story. And I think the bureaucratization of medicine, because like you said, when you talk about the grandfather, there's this image of the antacid that he keeps. It is also told that he has a 9-to-5 job in a job that never fires anyone else. So there's very boring bureaucratic quality about medicine, which I think is about to be subverted, because the gender angle comes in at the end, and all the other doctors are men. All the other doctors are nervous, and they're seen as not serious enough, or have no understanding of what really goes on in the human body. And I think the anticipatory quality of the woman about to become a doctor, we must weave in the gender angle too, because here she is, having got a glimpse of a female subversion of someone who makes an attempt to make memories before she dies. And that knowledge, that epistemic apparatus, as it were, in a very experiential way, enters the system as she's about to march forward and become a doctor. So in that sense, it really problematizes the maleness of medicine to a large extent, because it gives her the extra epistemic angle, right, that she's experienced with the great-grandmother, which she can integrate as she's about to become a doctor. So I think that makes it a little bit more complex than. But you're quite right. There is a flippancy, there's a bureaucratization of medicine which takes place, which is satirized, except in the end, which is, well, now that I have the knowledge, I've given myself the diarrhea, now I can move forward and do something different. So